The final lurch of the stagecoach threw Eleanor Vance against the worn leather siding. For 4 days, the world had been a jarring rhythm of dust, sweat, and the endless creak of wheels. Now a profound stillness fell, broken only by the snorting of tired horses and the driver's gruff voice calling out a name she barely recognized as her destination. Prosperity. She peered through the small, grimy window. The name was a cruel joke. The town was a single, sun-bleached street, a collection of tired wooden buildings hunkered down under an immense, indifferent sky. A fine, golden dust coated everything, a powdered residue of broken dreams. Her heart, which had been aflutter with a nervous hope, settled into a slow, heavy beat. This was not a beginning. It felt like an end. She had pictured this moment 100 times. In her small, stuffy room back east, she had read his letters by candlelight. The words of Jacob Miller were simple, direct, and honest. He wrote of his family's land, of the golden plains of Montana, of needing a partner to build a life. He never wrote of love, but he wrote of stability. And for Ellie, that was a far more precious commodity. She was 26, a former bookkeeper with a mind as sharp as a newly inked pen. That mind had gotten her into trouble, noticing figures that others preferred to keep hidden. After the scandal, the whispers, the quiet dismissal, a respectable marriage was no longer an option. A mail-order bride, however, could start over. She could be useful, she could be safe. The coach door swung open, flooding the cramped space with blinding light. "Prosperity," the driver grunted again. "End of the line, ma'am." Ellie gathered her small, sturdy valise and her composure. She had worn her best dress, a simple navy blue cotton that was now gray with dust. Her auburn hair, neatly pinned that morning, had escaped in rebellious strands around her face. She stepped down onto the wooden boardwalk, her boots making a solid, definitive sound. This is it. There is no going back. The air smelled of dry earth, horse, and something faintly metallic, like old anxieties. Several men loitering outside the saloon turned to stare, their curiosity open and unapologetic. She ignored them, her gaze sweeping the street for the man she only knew from a small, faded photograph. A man with kind eyes and a face already weathered by work. And then she saw him. He was standing by a sturdy farm wagon, his hands clasped awkwardly in front of him, Jacob Miller. He was taller than the photograph suggested, with broad shoulders that seemed to carry an invisible weight. The sun had carved fine lines around his brown eyes, but the kindness she had seen in the picture was there, buried under a layer of profound exhaustion. He was not looking at her with the eager anticipation of a groom-to-be. He was looking at her with the weary resignation of a man facing another long day's chore. He took a step forward as she approached, pulling off his sweat-stained hat. "Miss Vance?" His voice was quiet, deeper than she had imagined. "Mr. Miller," she replied, offering a small, steady smile. She had practiced this smile in her reflection. It was meant to convey calm competence, not girlish excitement. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you." "Jake, please," he said, his eyes flicking from her face to the ground and back again. "It's a long journey. You must be tired." "I am," she admitted, "but I am glad to have arrived." An awkward silence stretched between them. The staring eyes of the townsman felt like a physical pressure. Jake seemed to feel it too. He cleared his throat and gestured toward the wagon. "Well, let's get your trunk loaded. The homestead is a fair ride from here." The journey to the farm was almost entirely silent. Jake handled the horses with an easy, ingrained confidence, but he seemed to have no such confidence with conversation. Ellie, whose mind was usually a whirlwind of observations and calculations, found herself at a loss. She wanted to ask about the land, the crops, the town that called itself Prosperity. But the wall around him was so high, so thick, that any question felt like an intrusion. So she watched. She watched his hands on the reins, the knuckles calloused and scarred. They were the hands of a man who worked from sunup to sundown. She watched the set of his jaw, tight and unyielding. She saw the way his gaze drifted to the horizon, not with the pride of a landowner, but with the apprehension of a watchman scanning for a threat. His letters had spoken of the beauty of the plains, but he looked at them now as if they were his enemy. The farm appeared over a gentle rise in the land, a modest house and a large barn nestled in a shallow dip. The plains rolled away from it in every direction, vast and golden under the afternoon sun. It was beautiful in a stark and lonely way. As they drew closer, she could see the details. The farmhouse was clad in weathered wood, its paint peeling in long strips. The fence line was mended in a dozen different places with a dozen different types of wire. The place was not derelict. It was clean, and the vegetable garden near the house was meticulously tended. But it was all so terribly worn down, like an old coat that had been patched one too many times. It was a homestead fighting a long, slow war of attrition. Jake pulled the wagon to a halt near the front porch. "Here we are," he said, the words heavy, devoid of any pride or welcome. Ellie felt a strange mix of disappointment and fierce resolve. This was not the thriving future his letters had hinted at, but it was land, it was a house, it was a chance. It was hers to help shore up, to make strong. Her past had been built on the shifting sands of other people's finances. This was solid earth. "It has a good deal of potential," she said, her voice more certain than she felt. Jake gave a short, humorless laugh. "Potential. That's one word for it." He swung down from the wagon and moved to the back to unstrap her trunk. He lifted the heavy steamer trunk with a grunt of effort, his muscles straining under his worn shirt. He carried it onto the porch and set it down with a thud that seemed to echo in the quiet air. Ellie followed him into the house. The inside was much like the outside. It was scrubbed clean, but impossibly bare. A simple wooden table and 4 chairs stood in the main room, which served as both kitchen and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel empty. The air was cool and smelled of soap and something else, something sad and stale, like a room that had not heard laughter in a very long time. There was no clutter, no pictures, no sign that this was a home filled with life. It was just a shelter. "Your room is upstairs," Jake said, gesturing vaguely. "First door on the left. I'll bring your trunk." He did not offer to show her. He seemed desperate to finish the transaction, to get her settled so he could retreat back into his solitude. She found the room easily. It was small, with a single window looking out over the fields, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden dresser, and a washstand were the only furniture. It was monastic in its simplicity, but the window was clean, and the afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the specks of dust dancing in the air. Ellie walked to the window and placed her hand on the sill. The wood was smooth from age. Outside, the world was immense. For the first time since arriving, a genuine feeling of hope, fragile but real, unfurled within her. This could be a home. Her home. She came back downstairs to find Jake standing by the table, staring into a cup of coffee he had poured for himself. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of something, maybe surprise in his eyes. "I can start dinner," she offered, "if you show me where things are." He nodded slowly. "Right, of course." They worked in a strange, silent tandem. He showed her the pantry, the flour bin, the smoked meat in the cellar. His movements were economical, weary. He seemed to be moving through molasses, every action requiring a monumental effort. Ellie, in contrast, felt a surge of energy. This was purpose. This was order she could create. She found potatoes, onions, and flour. Soon the smell of frying bacon and onions filled the sterile air, chasing some of the shadows from the corners. They ate at the big wooden table. The food was good, and the silence was even louder than it had been in the wagon. Ellie tried once. "The soil seems rich. What do you primarily grow?" "Wheat," he answered, not looking up from his plate. "When the rain comes." "And when it doesn't?" He finally met her eyes, and for a second she saw a flash of raw, bitter anger. "Then it doesn't." He looked back down at his plate, and the wall between them was back, higher than before. She did not try again. She ate her meal, her mind cataloging the state of the house, the farm, the man across from her. He was a puzzle of missing pieces. A man who owned all this land but seemed trapped by it. A man who had sought a wife but now seemed to regret her presence. She had imagined their first evening would be one of quiet conversation, of sharing histories and planning a future. Instead, she felt like a ghost who had wandered into someone else's private grief. When the meal was over, Jake stood abruptly. "Thank you for the meal. It was good." He carried his plate to the wash basin, his movements stiff. "I have work in the office." Ellie watched him go. He disappeared into a small room off the main living area, closing the door most of the way, but not quite latching it. An office. On a farm this size, an office seemed like a grand term. She cleared the rest of the table, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She washed the dishes, the warm water a small comfort. The house was quiet again, save for the chirp of crickets outside and the faint rustle of papers from behind the office door. She dried her hands and found herself standing in the center of the room, unsure of what to do next. She was his fiancée, soon to be his wife. This was to be her home. Yet she felt like a guest in a boarding house, one who had overstayed her welcome on the very first night. She thought about unpacking her trunk, arranging her few belongings in the small upstairs room, but she felt a deep reluctance to put down roots until she understood the ground she was standing on. A quiet sound from the office drew her attention. It was not a sound of work. It was the heavy final sound of a book being closed. Then silence. A deep, unnerving silence. Curiosity and a feeling she could not name, a protective instinct, perhaps, pulled her forward. She moved silently, her soft-soled shoes making no noise on the worn wooden floorboards. She stopped just before the doorway, staying in the shadows of the main room. The door was open just a crack, a vertical sliver of lamplight cutting through the gloom. She could see him. Jake was sitting at a small, cluttered desk. He was not writing, he was not reading. He was just staring. His hands were flat on the desk on either side of a large, thick book bound in dark, cracked leather. It looked ancient, heavy. His shoulders were slumped forward, his head bowed. The lamplight carved deep shadows into his face, making him look years older. It was not the face of a tired farmer. It was the face of a man who had been defeated, utterly and completely broken. His gaze was fixed on the closed ledger, but he was not seeing it. He was looking through it, into a chasm of despair so deep that Ellie felt a cold dread creep up her spine. All the exhaustion, the silence, the tension of the day suddenly coalesced into this single devastating image. The problem was not the farm. It was not the lack of rain. It was not her. The source of the shadow that haunted this house and this man was sitting right there on the desk. It was hidden between the covers of that worn-out book. That evening, standing in the dark, Eleanor Vance looked through the open door of the small office and saw Jacob Miller staring blankly at the large ledger, his face a perfect mask of hopelessness. She stood in the hallway, a shadow in the dim lamplight, long after he had closed the office door. The image of his face, illuminated by the single flickering lamp, was seared into her mind. It was not the face of a man simply tired from a long day's work. It was the face of a man looking into a grave. Ellie turned and walked to her small room, the floorboards cool beneath her bare feet. The house was clean, but it held a deep, settled stillness, like a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, cutting across the dusty air and landing on the worn wooden table. Jake was already gone, out in the fields before the sun had fully risen. The silence he left behind was heavy with the things he could not say. Ellie tied her auburn hair back with a piece of twine. She looked at the thin layer of dust on every surface, the faint smell of neglect that clung to the curtains. She had come here for a new life, for a home. She would not let that home be a monument to misery. She started in the kitchen. She filled a bucket with water from the pump outside, the handle groaning in protest. She added a sliver of harsh lye soap, watching it dissolve into cloudy whiteness. Then she began to scrub. She washed the floors on her hands and knees, the rough wood scraping her skin, but the physical work was a relief. It was a problem she could solve. With every circle of her rag, she felt she was wiping away not just dirt, but the very essence of the despair she had seen on Jake's face. She washed the windows until the morning sun wasn't just a visitor, but a resident, flooding the room with uncompromising light. She moved through the small house like a quiet storm. She beat the dust from rugs outside, sending clouds of the past puffing into the dry air. She found a stash of old linens, yellowed and smelling of disuse, and boiled them in the big copper pot on the stove until they were white again. The smell of soap and clean, sun-dried cotton slowly began to overpower the scent of dust and sorrow. It was a small change, but it was a change she had made. It was her first foothold in this new life, a declaration that she was here now, and things would not simply be as they had been. When Jake came in for his midday meal, he stopped just inside the doorway. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the brightness inside. The floors gleamed faintly. The table was set for two, a clean cloth spread over the wood. A jar of wildflowers she had picked from the edge of the wheat field sat in the center. He said nothing, he just stood there, his large frame filling the doorway, his work-worn hands hanging at his sides. He looked from the sparkling window panes to the neatly arranged pantry shelves. Ellie held her breath. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She had not asked for permission. She had simply done it, an invasion of his long-held solitude. She watched his gaze travel over every detail, his tired brown eyes taking in the transformation. He was a man who seemed to carry the weight of the entire sky on his shoulders, and she feared she had just added to the load. He finally looked at her. He took a slow breath, and a small, almost imperceptible shift happened in his expression. The deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes seemed to soften, just for a moment. A smile touched his lips. It was not a happy smile. It was something far more fragile and precious. It was a smile of weary surprise, of a man seeing a sliver of light after years spent in a dim room. "It's clean," he said. His voice was low, rough with disuse, as if the word itself was unfamiliar. Ellie let out the breath she was holding. "I thought it could use some fresh air," she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. He walked to the table and pulled out a chair, his movements still careful, almost hesitant. He ran a hand over the smooth, clean surface of the wood. For the first time since she had arrived, the quiet between them felt comfortable. It was not the silence of unspoken anxieties, but the shared quiet of a meal, of a small moment of peace carved out of a difficult day. They ate the simple stew she had made and the bread she had baked. Jake ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring not just the food but the feeling of order around him. When he finished, he pushed his chair back and looked at her again, the ghost of that smile still in his eyes. "Thank you, Ellie," "Oh," he said. The words were simple, but they landed in her heart like stones in still water. It was the first time he had used her name with such warmth. It was a beginning, a fragile, uncertain beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. That evening, the tentative warmth of their shared meal lingered in the air. The house felt different, lighter. As Ellie cleared the last of their dinner plates, she decided to take a chance. She felt the small bridge of trust that had been built between them, and she wanted to see if it would hold her weight. Jake was sitting in his usual chair, staring into the middle distance, but the tension in his shoulders was gone. He looked tired but peaceful. "The farm is beautiful, Jake," she began, her voice soft. "Your family has worked this land for a long time." He nodded, his gaze shifting to the window, to the darkening fields outside. "My father and his father before him. This land is all we've ever had." There was a pride in his voice that she had not heard before, a deep current of love for the soil beneath their feet. This was her opening. She took a breath. "It must take a great deal to keep it all going," she said, choosing her words with the precision of a surgeon. "All the planning, the accounts." She paused, then added, "I saw you with your books last night. You looked troubled." The change was instantaneous and brutal. The fragile piece shattered like glass. Jake's body went rigid, the muscles in his jaw tightening. The light in his eyes vanished, replaced by a shuttered, defensive hardness. He turned his head slowly to look at her, and his gaze was cold. It was the look of a man guarding a wound, warning her away. "The books are my concern," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any of the earlier warmth. The rejection was a physical blow. Ellie felt her cheeks flush, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration rising in her throat. She had been so careful. "I only meant," she started, trying to salvage the moment. "Back in Philadelphia, I worked as a bookkeeper for a large shipping company. I'm good with numbers. If you ever needed a second pair of eyes, just to help with the burden—" "I don't need help," he cut her off, his voice sharper now. He stood up abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the clean floor. He loomed over her for a second, a stranger once more, his face a mask of anger and shame. "It's handled. I handle it. You don't need to worry about it." He turned his back on her and walked stiffly to his small office, closing the door behind him with a quiet, definitive click. The sound echoed in the silent room. Ellie stood by the table, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The wall between them was back, higher and thicker than before. She had tried to reach out, to offer the one skill she truly possessed, and he had thrown it back in her face. She felt a sting of anger, but beneath it was a deeper, colder current of resolve. He was not just being proud, he was afraid. He was terribly afraid. People did not guard their financial books with that kind of ferocity unless there was something in them they were desperate to hide or desperate not to see. The ledger was not just a record of the farm, it was the source of the despair she saw in his eyes, and he was determined to face it alone. The next 2 days passed in a strained, polite silence. Ellie continued her work, making the house more of a home, but the shared smiles and easy quiet were gone. She and Jake moved around each other like ghosts, their conversations limited to the necessities of the day. The pump needs a new washer. I'll be in the south pasture. Dinner is ready. Each polite phrase was a brick in the wall he was rebuilding between them. Ellie watched him. She saw how his gaze would drift toward the closed office door, how his hands would sometimes clench for no reason as he stared out at his fields. The weight was back on his shoulders, heavier than ever. He worked from before sunrise until long after sunset, pushing his body to the point of collapse, as if physical exhaustion could chase away the demons that plagued his mind. Then, on the third evening, as they sat at the dinner table in near total silence, he spoke. He didn't look at her. He stared at his plate, pushing a piece of potato around with his fork. "There's a man coming from town tomorrow," he said, his voice low and tight, "to collect the payment." Ellie stopped eating. The fork in her hand felt heavy. "The payment?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "For the loan, he said, still not looking up. "My father took it out years ago. We've been paying on it ever since." He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were filled with a familiar mix of shame and defiance. "It's a regular thing. Nothing to be concerned about." But his words were a lie. His entire body screamed that it was something to be concerned about. The casual way he said it was so forced, so unnatural, it was like a terrible actor reciting the line. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the small house changed. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a nervous energy that was almost suffocating. It was as if a storm was gathering just over the horizon, and they were both waiting for it to break. Jake became a phantom. He barely ate. He moved with a restless, agitated energy, checking the horizon 100 times, pacing the length of the porch, his boots thudding a nervous rhythm on the wood. He spoke even less, and when he did, his voice was strained. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the window frames made him jump. Ellie found it impossible to settle. She tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. She tried to sew, but she kept pricking her finger, her hands unsteady. The dread was contagious. It seeped into the walls, into the very floorboards. She felt like she was living in the moments before an execution. What kind of payment, what kind of man could reduce this strong, capable farmer to a bundle of raw nerves? The day of the collection dawned gray and overcast, the sky a blanket of flat, colorless cloud. The tension was now a living thing in the house. Jake had been out since first light, but not to work. He was just moving things, from the barn to the shed and back again, pointless, repetitive tasks that did nothing but burn off his frantic energy. He came inside near midday, his face pale beneath its tan, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool air. They sat at the kitchen table, waiting. Neither of them spoke. The ticking of the small clock on the mantelpiece was the only sound, each tick a hammer blow against the silence. Ellie watched Jake. He stared at his hands, calloused and stained with dirt, as if he had never seen them before. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. She could see a muscle twitching in his cheek, a frantic, uncontrollable rhythm. She wanted to reach out, to place her hand over his, to tell him that they were in this together. But she knew he would pull away. The wall was too high now. He was alone in his prison of fear, and he had locked the door from the inside. The afternoon dragged on. The sun never broke through the clouds. The world outside the window seemed muted and still, holding its breath just as they were. Finally, as dusk began to settle, Jake stood up. "He's not coming today," he said, his voice hollow. Maybe tomorrow. The relief in his voice was so profound it was almost painful to hear. It was the relief of a temporary reprieve, not a pardon. The storm had not passed. It had only been delayed. That night, Ellie lay in her bed, staring into the darkness of her small room. The house was silent, but it was a tense, listening silence. Sleep was impossible. Her mind raced, turning over the events of the last few days. The weary smile, the cold rejection, the suffocating fear that had consumed the man she was supposed to build a life with. This was not a debt, it was a haunting. It was a sickness that was slowly killing the soul of this man and his farm. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic creak from just outside her window. She sat up listening. It was the sound of boots on the wooden porch. A slow, steady, relentless tread, back and forth, back and forth. It was Jake, pacing in the darkness like a caged animal, unable to find rest even in the dead of night. The sound was the loneliest thing she had ever heard. It was the sound of a man walking in circles inside his own prison. Lying there in the dark, listening to the hopeless rhythm of his pacing, something inside Ellie shifted. The last of her uncertainty burned away, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. Concern became resolve. Pity became purpose. She would not stand by and watch this good man be broken by a shadow. She would not live in a house ruled by fear. She would drag his secrets into the light, whether he wanted her to or not. As she lies awake in her small room, Ellie overhears Jake pacing outside, and she makes a silent vow to understand what is breaking him. The morning air was different. It lacked the usual gentle promise of a new day. Instead, a stillness had settled over the farm, a heavy waiting silence that clung to the dry grass and seeped through the cracks in the walls. Ellie felt it as she kneaded dough for the day's bread, her knuckles pressing into the soft mass. Her movements were mechanical, a rhythm she had learned for comfort, but today it offered none. She watched Jake through the kitchen window. He was mending a fence post near the barn, his motions stiff and jerky. He would hammer a nail, then stop, his gaze lost on the horizon where the dusty road met the sky. He was watching for someone, the man from town. Ellie had tried to ask him about it yesterday evening after she overheard him pacing in the dark. She had found him staring at the flickering flame of a lantern, his face carved with shadows. When she softly asked if everything was all right, he had simply shaken his head. The words were trapped behind his pride, sealed away with a shame she was only beginning to understand. He had told her the payment was due, nothing more. But the way his jaw tightened told a much longer story, a story written in every line on his tired face, in the slump of his broad shoulders. He was a strong man, bent under a weight she could not see. She shaped the dough into loaves and set them near the hearth to rise. The simple domestic act felt like a lie. She was playing the part of a wife in a home that felt more like a hostage. Every hour that passed, the tension in the small house grew thicker. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed to get louder, each second a small tap of a hammer against an anvil. Jake finally came inside around midday. He did not look at her. He washed his hands in the basin, the splashing water the only sound. He looked pale beneath his tan, his eyes darting towards the door every few moments. He took out a small, worn leather pouch from a locked box in his office. Ellie watched from the doorway as he untied the drawstring and emptied a small pile of coins onto his desk. He counted them slowly, his lips moving without a sound. He stacked them, then counted them again. The sum was clearly not enough for him to feel secure, but it was all he had. He poured the coins back into the pouch and pulled the string tight, his knuckles white. He placed the pouch on the corner of the kitchen table, as if it were a sacrifice awaiting the priest. Then they waited. The sound came just after 1 o'clock. The steady, unhurried clip-clop of a single horse. It was not the sound of a neighbor or a friendly traveler. This rhythm was deliberate, patient, and menacing. Jake stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He did not say a word to Ellie. He simply walked to the door, his steps heavy, and went outside onto the porch. Ellie moved to the kitchen window, her heart beginning a low, painful thud against her ribs. She wiped her damp hands on her apron, her fingers trembling slightly. The rider came into view. He was a large man, broad in the shoulders, wearing a dark, heavy coat despite the afternoon warmth. The coat was expensive, made of thick wool, out of place among the faded cotton and worn leather of the homestead. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but Ellie could see a square jaw and a grim, impassive mouth. He rode a powerful black horse that seemed to look down on the tired farm with the same disdain as its owner. He did not dismount immediately. He sat in his saddle, looking over the property, his gaze lingering on the sagging roof of the barn, the unpainted fence. It was an inspection, a quiet, cold assessment of his property, because that is what it felt like. Finally, he swung his leg over and stepped onto the ground. His boots were polished, an obscene shine in the swirling dust. He walked not to the house, but to Jake, who stood waiting on the bottom step of the porch. The man stopped a few feet from him, forcing Jake to look up slightly. Even from the window, Ellie could feel the shift in power. It was like watching a hawk land near a sparrow. "Miller," the man said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of any warmth. It carried easily in the still air. "I have it," Jake said. His own voice was thin, strained. The man in the dark coat held out a gloved hand. He did not move, did not speak again. He simply waited. Jake reached into his pocket and produced the small leather pouch. He held it out, but the man did not take it. He gestured with his chin towards the porch railing. "Count it out," the man commanded. A flush of color rose on Jake's neck. Ellie felt a hot surge of anger in her chest. This was not a transaction. This was a ritual of humiliation in front of his own home, in front of her, his intended wife, watching from the window. Jake hesitated for a fraction of a second. His hands, usually so steady with tools and reins, fumbled with the pouch's drawstring. He poured the coins onto the flat top of the railing. The man in the coat leaned against a porch support, crossing his arms. He watched as Jake began to separate the coins into small stacks. One by one, the clink of each coin on the wood was sharp, obscene. Ellie could see Jake's fingers shaking. He was trying to be careful, but a few coins slipped from his grasp, falling to the dusty porch floor. He had to bend down to retrieve them, a man scavenging for pennies at the feet of a king. "Slowly, Miller," the man said, his voice laced with a cold amusement. "We wouldn't want to make a mistake. Mistakes are costly." Ellie pressed her hand against the window pane, the glass cool against her hot skin. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run out there and throw the coins in the man's smug, shadowy face. But she knew it would only make things worse for Jake. She was a stranger here, a mail-order bride with no standing, no power. All she could do was watch as the man she had agreed to build a life with was dismantled, piece by piece. Jake finished counting. "It's all there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He gestured to the neat stacks of silver and copper. The man pushed himself off the post and walked to the railing. He did not recount the money himself. He simply looked at it. Then he looked at Jake. His gaze was heavy, appraising. "Your father," the man said, his voice dropping into a conversational, almost philosophical tone. "He was a good man, a hard worker, but he wasn't good with numbers. He made promises he couldn't keep." He picked up a single silver dollar, turning it over in his gloved fingers. He dreamed bigger than his pockets, a common flaw. The words struck Jake like a physical blow. He flinched, his head dropping. The insult was not just to him, but to his father's memory. It poisoned the very reason Jake was enduring all of this, the filial duty that had become his cage. Ellie felt tears of rage sting her eyes. This was not about money. This was about breaking a man's spirit, about ensuring he never believed he was worthy of anything more than this servitude. It was about owning his past, his present, and his future. The man swept the coins from the railing into his own, much larger leather satchel. The sound was like a landslide in the quiet yard. "Mr. Blackwood appreciates your promptness," he said, the use of the formal name a final assertion of distance and power. "He trusts you'll be just as prompt next month." It was not a question. It was a fact. He turned without another word and walked back to his horse. He mounted with an easy, fluid motion, a man entirely comfortable with his place in the world. He gave one last, lingering look at the house, and for a moment Ellie felt his cold gaze pass over the window where she stood. She did not shrink back. She met his unseen eyes, her heart pounding with a cold, hard fury. A fury that was entirely new. It was not the desperate fear of her past. It was something clean, something sharp. It was the anger of a mathematician who has just seen a perfect equation deliberately broken. The man spurred his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust that slowly settled back onto the parched earth. Jake did not move. He stood on the porch staring at the empty space where the man had been. His hands were curled into tight fists at his sides, his knuckles bloodless. He stood there for a long time, so long that a bird landed on the railing where the money had been, chirped a few times, and flew away. The sun beat down on his back. Ellie watched him, her anger solidifying into a cold, heavy resolve in the pit of her stomach. The pity she had felt for him was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a different emotion. It was a protective, ferocious determination. The man in the dark coat, Mr. Blackwood's messenger, had intended to crush Jake's hope, but he had accidentally ignited something in her. Finally, Jake turned and walked back into the house. He moved like an old man, each step an effort. He walked past Ellie without seeing her. His eyes were vacant, fixed on some distant internal horror. The smell of dust and defeat followed him into the kitchen. He sank into a chair at the table, his body seeming to collapse into itself. He stared at the empty tabletop, at the place where the pouch of money had sat. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is over, filled with the ghosts of what had been lost. Ellie wanted to go to him, to place a hand on his shoulder, to offer some word of comfort. But what could she say? It will be all right? It was a lie. You are a good man. He had just been told he was the son of a failure, and his posture screamed that he believed it. Words were useless against this kind of wound. They were just sounds in a void of profound shame. She busied herself at the stove, her hands now steady. Her anger had burned away the trembling. She served the bread she had baked in a stew she had kept warm. They ate in silence. Jake barely touched his food. He pushed the stew around his bowl with a spoon, his gaze never lifting. Every small sound, the scrape of a fork, the clink of a glass, was unnaturally loud. Ellie ate, making herself chew and swallow because she knew she would need her strength. She was no longer just a hopeful bride. She was a witness. And what she had witnessed was not just a debt collection. It was a crime, a slow, methodical theft of a man's life and dignity. After the meal, which was more of a vigil, Jake stood up. He walked into his small office, the one where Ellie had first seen him with the ledger. He returned a moment later, carrying the heavy, leather-bound book. It looked impossibly heavy in his arms. He placed it on the kitchen table, the thud echoing in the quiet room. He opened it. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, a sprawling 15-year history of payments and interest, of hope dwindling into obligation. He stared at the open page. His finger traced a line of cramped handwriting, his father's, before moving to a newer entry, his own. His face was a mask of utter desolation. He had been paying for his father's dream, and in return he was being punished for it. The honor he thought he was upholding had been twisted into a weapon of his own subjugation. He looked at the endless columns of debt, a chain forged of ink and paper that was stronger than any iron. Ellie watched him, her breath caught in her throat. She saw the last flicker of resistance die in his eyes. It was a terrible thing to see, a light going out. He closed his eyes for a moment, a single, shuddering breath escaping his lips. It was the sound of surrender. Then he pushed his chair back abruptly. He did not close the ledger. He did not put it away. He simply turned his back on it, on the record of his family's long defeat. He walked to the door, his movements stiff, his gaze fixed on nothing. He walked out of the house, letting the screen door slam shut behind him. Ellie heard his footsteps cross the porch and fade as he walked towards the barn, the one place he could still feel a sense of purpose. She was alone in the kitchen. The last rays of the setting sun slanted through the window, falling across the table. They illuminated the open book. The ledger lay there, exposed and vulnerable. A 15-year story of struggle left open for anyone to read. In his moment of complete defeat, Jake had done something he would never have done otherwise. He had walked away and left the source of his shame unguarded. Ellie stared at the book, at the columns of numbers, the dates, the carefully noted payments. Her concern was gone, burned away by the cold fire of what she'd seen. In its place was a sharp, clear purpose. Her vow was no longer just to understand, it was to act. The house settled into a profound silence that sleep could not penetrate. Outside, the wind whispered through the dry grasses, a lonely sound that seemed to carry the weight of the vast, empty plains. Ellie lay in her bed, staring into the darkness of her small room. The thin mattress felt lumpy beneath her, the sheets coarse against her skin. But it was not physical discomfort that kept her awake. It was the image of Jake, seared into her mind. The way his broad shoulders had slumped in the afternoon light. The hollow look in his eyes as he handed over the wad of worn bills. The utter and complete absence of a fight in him. She had come here for a new life, for the promise of a home built on shared work and simple honesty. She had imagined hardship. Yes, she had prepared for droughts, for poor harvests, for the back-breaking labor of a farm. She had not prepared for this slow, soul-crushing despair. A despair that had a name and a face, a man who sent his lackeys to humiliate another man on his own land. A cold anger, sharp and unfamiliar, coiled in her stomach. It wasn't anger on behalf of Jake, but it was also for herself. She had run from a world where clever men with soft hands used numbers to trap people. She would not stand by and watch it happen again. The floorboards were cool against the soles of her feet as she slipped out of her room. She moved through the small, dark house with a practiced quiet, her hand trailing along the wall for guidance. In the kitchen, a single beam of moonlight cut across the room, illuminating a fine layer of dust on the wooden floor. It fell upon the table and upon the object that had drawn her from her bed. The ledger. It lay open just as Jake had left it. A book of sorrows, its pages filled with 15 years of struggle. For a long moment, Ellie just stood there, her arms wrapped around herself. A part of her felt like a trespasser, prying into a private history of pain that was not hers to know. This book contained the story of Jake and his father, of their sweat and their failures. It felt sacred in its own sad way, but then the image of Jake's face returned, not filled with pride for his legacy, but with the shame of his inheritance. The book was not a history, it was a cage, and he was trapped inside it. This was not just his problem anymore. The shadow that fell over him fell over her, too. It fell over the very foundations of the home she was trying to build. With a soft scrape that sounded like a shout in the stillness, she pulled a chair away from the table and sat down. She lit the small oil lamp, and a warm, flickering glow pushed back the gloom. The flame danced in her eyes as she leaned forward, the scent of kerosene and old paper filling her senses. The pages were yellowed and soft at the edges, worn thin by the passage of years and worried hands. Two distinct styles of handwriting filled the columns. One was an older, more elegant script, the letters formed with a deliberate precision. That must have been Jake's father. The other was Jake's own hand, more rushed and pragmatic, the numbers clear but lacking any flourish. Her own hands, which had spent years dancing across ledgers in a stuffy city office, felt a strange sense of purpose. This was a language she understood. She told herself she was only trying to grasp the scale of the debt that held this good man in its grip. Her eyes went to the most recent page, detailing the payment that had been collected just that afternoon. She saw the starting balance for the month, the interest applied, the payment Jake had made, and the new, only slightly smaller balance. Her mind, a tool honed by years of practice, began its work almost without her permission. It was an instinct, a reflex. She didn't need a pen or an abacus. The numbers lined up in her head. She traced the lines with her index finger, her lips moving silently. Principal times the rate divided by 12 months. It was a simple calculation she had performed thousands of times. The figure for this month seemed correct. She turned the page back, looking at the previous month. Again, the math held. A small knot of disappointment formed in her chest. She did not know what she was hoping to find, but a part of her had desperately wanted a mistake. A flaw, something to explain the suffocating sense of injustice. Perhaps there was nothing to find. Perhaps it was just a terrible, but honest debt. She went back another month. Her finger stopped. It hovered over a single number in the interest column. Her brow furrowed. She leaned closer, the lamplight casting a stark shadow across her face. It was a tiny thing. Insignificant, really. Just a few dollars, an overcharge of less than the price of a sack of flour. Anyone else would have missed it. A tired farmer, His mind on the weather and the health of his livestock would never have noticed such a pittance. But to Eleanor Vance, a bookkeeper by trade and by nature, it was a glaring error. It was a wrong note in a piece of music, a crooked stitch in a fine seam. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She did the calculation again in her head, slowly this time, deliberately. Principal, interest rate, time. There was no ambiguity. The number written in the ledger was wrong. It was too high. She sat back in her chair, the wood creaking in protest. It could be a simple mistake, a slip of the pen, a moment of distraction. Clerical errors happened. They were a part of any accounting. But as she stared at the number, she recalled the cold, predatory gleam in the eyes of the man who had come to the farm. She remembered the slow, deliberate way he had counted the money, a performance of power and dominance. Men like that did not make careless mistakes. Their mistakes were always careful. A new kind of coldness settled over her, one that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the cold steel of suspicion. This tiny error felt like a test, a probe, a way of seeing what they could get away with. If you can steal a few dollars without anyone noticing, perhaps next time you can steal a few more. The feeling was a familiar one. It was the sickening recognition of a predator testing the strength of a cage, looking for the weakest bar. The small overcharge was not just an error, it was a thread, and she had the sudden, overwhelming urge to pull it. Her breath was shallow, her focus absolute. The emotional worry she felt for Jake was still there, a low hum beneath the surface. But on top of it now was something else. It was the sharp, clear focus of the professional, the hunter. The part of her that had been dormant since she left the city, the part of her that found truth in the unyielding logic of numbers, was now wide awake. This was no longer just about Jake's feelings or her own hopes for a home. This was a puzzle, a crime scene written in ink and paper. Driven by an urgency she could not explain, she began to turn the pages backward. She skipped past the entries from the last year, her intuition telling her the real answers lay deeper in the past. The pages whispered as they turned, a sound that seemed to count the years falling away. 1 year, 2 years, 3. The handwriting changed, becoming purely that of Jake's father. The ink was faded, the paper more brittle. She was moving backward into a history of hope turning to desperation. 4 years, 5. She stopped on a page at random, her eyes scanning the columns. The date at the top was from the spring of 5 years ago. Jake's hand was back, now layered over his father's last entries. It must have been not long after his father had passed. Her gaze fell upon one particular line. It was a large payment, far larger than the usual monthly sum. A note beside it simply said, "Good harvest." Ellie felt a pang of something, a ghost of the pride and relief Jake must have felt when he made that payment. A chance to finally get ahead, to knock the principal down in a meaningful way. It was a payment born of a successful year, of sweat and sun and luck. It represented a significant blow against the debt. Her eyes moved to the very next line, the entry for the following month. Her blood ran cold. She stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. She read it again, and a third time. The interest, the crushing, relentless interest, had been calculated on the previous, higher balance. The large payment, the fruit of that entire successful season, had been completely ignored in the calculation. It was as if it had never been made. It was an overcharge of not a few dollars, but hundreds. For a farm like this, at that time, it was a catastrophic sum. It would have wiped out any progress, erased any hope gained from that good harvest. It would have been a kick in the teeth, a plunge back into the depths just as he was nearing the surface. Her hands began to tremble, a tremor that started in her fingertips and spread up her arms. This was no clerical error. This could not be a mistake. No one could make a mistake of this magnitude by accident. It was deliberate. It was theft. Then, she saw it. Beside the fraudulent interest charge was a small, neat asterisk. Her eyes darted to the bottom of the page, searching for the corresponding note. There it was, written in a tidy, almost elegant script that was neither Jake's nor his father's. It was the writing of a third person. It said, "Adjustment for market fluctuation." Ellie whispered the words aloud into the silent kitchen. Market fluctuation. The phrase was meaningless, absurd. A loan of this type, a simple mortgage on a property, would have a fixed rate. There was no market to fluctuate. It was a lie. It was a sophisticated, condescending lie designed to sound official, to confuse and intimidate a man who knew dirt and weather, not finance. It was the language of the men she had fled, the smooth, empty words they used to disguise their greed. A wave of fury, so pure and so intense it left her breathless, washed over her. She saw it all with sickening clarity. The 15 years of struggle. Jake's father working himself into an early grave. Jake taking on the burden, his youth and hope slowly ground away, paying and paying, never getting ahead. Because the game was rigged. The ledger in front of her was not a record of debt. It was a confession. It was the meticulous, long-term blueprint of a robbery. And she was the only person who had ever thought to read it. She stared at the glaring lie on the page, the damning proof of a fortune stolen, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was only the beginning. The glaring error stared back at her from the page, a ghost figure that had stolen a small fortune 5 years ago. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The house was silent, save for the low groan of wood settling in the cool night air. Outside, Jake was a shadow in the barn, lost in whatever private grief he went to when the world became too much. The kitchen was her sanctuary, the ledger her battlefield. The lamplight cast a warm, isolated circle on the table, turning the rest of the world to darkness. This was not just one mistake. Her intuition, honed by years of adding columns for men who cared only for the final sum, screamed at her. Mistakes were random. They favored the clerk as often as the client. This felt different. This felt deliberate. Her hand, steady and sure, turned another page, then another, moving deeper into the past. Her gaze scanned the columns, the familiar dance of debits and credits, payments and interest. Another discrepancy. 3 years before the last one. A smaller amount, disguised as a fee for late payment. But there was no record of a late payment, only a notation in Silas Blackwood's crisp, elegant script. She sat back, the wooden chair creaking under the small movement. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was looking at a map of a crime, but she only had one side of the story. The ledger was Blackwood's version of the truth. To challenge it, she needed proof. She needed the Miller's own records. A sudden thought propelled her from the chair. The small, cramped room off the parlor that Jake used as an office. He had called it his father's study. It was where she had seen him that first night, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She took the lamp, its light throwing long, dancing shadows on the walls as she moved through the quiet house. The office smelled of dust, old paper, and a faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco, a ghost of Jake's father. It was a room of masculine neglect. A layer of fine dust covered everything. A bookshelf held volumes on agriculture and animal husbandry, their spines cracked and faded. On the floor, beside a simple wooden desk, sat a dusty, unassuming wooden crate. It wasn't locked. With a trembling hand, she lifted the lid. Her breath hitched. Inside were stacks of papers, bundled with twine. Receipts, hundreds of them. Scraps of paper, some neatly printed from Blackwood's office, others hastily scribbled on bits of mercantile letterhead. There were bank drafts, promissory notes, and letters. It was 15 years of a family's financial life, a chaotic testament to their struggle. She felt a profound sense of trespassing, of intruding on the private history of two men she barely knew. But the feeling was quickly overwhelmed by a cold, righteous anger. This was not trespassing. This was an excavation. She carried the box back to the kitchen table, her movements precise and quiet. She cleared a space, pushing aside the salt cellar and a bowl of mending. One by one, she began to untie the brittle twine, the dust puffing up in the lamplight. The first bundle was for the most recent years. She found the receipt for the payment Jake had made just a few days ago, the one that had left him so broken. She placed it beside the corresponding entry in the ledger. It matched. Of course it did. The recent lies would be the most carefully hidden. She needed to go back to the beginning. She found the oldest bundle, the paper yellowed and fragile. The year Jake's father had taken the loan, 15 years ago. She would rebuild the entire history from scratch. She found a stack of unused paper in the office, clean and waiting. With a ruler from a desk drawer and a sharpened pencil, she drew her own columns. Date, payment, principal, interest, balance. It was a mirror of Blackwood's ledger, but this one would be hers. This one would be true. The hours began to blur. The only sounds were the rustle of paper, the scratch of her pencil, and the quiet hiss of the kerosene lamp. She worked with a ferocity she hadn't felt in years. This was not the soul-crushing work of her past, tallying profits for a man who saw her as a machine. This was a hunt. With every receipt she found, every bank draft she cross-referenced, a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. She found the receipt for the late payment from 8 years ago. It was dated a full week before the deadline. She made a note, her pencil pressing so hard it nearly tore the paper. Her blood ran hot with indignation. She brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma filling the silent kitchen. She drank it black, the bitter liquid a welcome shock to her system. As she worked her way through the years, a portrait of two men emerged from the numbers. Jake's father, Thomas, had been meticulous in his own way. His payments were consistent, almost desperate in their regularity. He had fought to keep his head above water, paying every extra dollar he could spare from a good harvest, trying to chip away at the mountain of debt. Then, after his passing, the entries changed. Jake's payments were just as regular, but there was a sense of resignation in them. He was simply paying what was demanded, no more, no less. He was not trying to win a war, he was just trying to survive the occupation. Ellie's heart ached for him, for both of them. She saw their lives laid bare in these columns of figures. A good crop meant a slightly larger payment. A bad winter meant a struggle to meet the minimum, followed by a punishing interest charge. Blackwood's ledger recorded it all with chilling dispassion. But her ledger, her shadow ledger, told a different story. It recorded the truth she was uncovering, receipt by receipt. Around 2 in the morning, her back was a knot of pain, and her eyes burned from staring at the tiny figures. She found a cluster of entries from about 10 years ago. Blackwood's ledger showed a series of recalculated interest payments, with a note citing market fluctuations. The result was that a huge portion of Thomas Miller's payments for that year had been swallowed by interest, barely touching the principal loan. But tucked into a bundle of receipts, Ellie found a letter from the bank. It stated that interest rates for agricultural loans had remained stable, even dropping slightly during that exact period. She stopped, her pencil hovering over the page. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was fraud. Bold, calculated, and cruel. She felt a wave of nausea. Silas Blackwood had not just been a lender, he had been a predator, slowly bleeding this family dry, knowing they were too isolated, too proud, and too trusting to question his authority. He had used their honesty against them. He had counted on their decency. Her fury gave her new strength. The pain in her back faded. The tiredness in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, burning focus. She worked faster, her hands flying across the pages. She matched receipt after receipt, uncovering a dozen more clerical errors, recalculation fees, and administrative charges. Each one was a small cut, but together they amounted to a mortal wound. Each discovery was a vindication and an agony. She was proving Jake's family had been wronged, but she was also quantifying the exact depth of their stolen life. The night wore on. A lone coyote howled in the distance, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the loneliness of her task. She didn't feel alone. She felt like an avenger, a silent warrior fighting a battle with ink and paper. She was fighting for the weary man sleeping in the next room. She was fighting for the ghost of his father, a man she had never met but now felt she knew intimately through his desperate, orderly receipts. She was fighting for this house, for the sunlight that streamed through its dusty windows, for the promise of a home she so desperately wanted. As the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, she reached the entries from 7 years ago. Her own ledger was now a dense tapestry of numbers and angry notations in the margins. Her hand was cramping, her knuckles white as she gripped the pencil. She worked through the payments for that year, her movements slow and deliberate now. She added up the payments made, subtracted them from the balance she had so carefully reconstructed, calculated the interest based on the bank's actual rates, not Blackwood's fantasy numbers. Then she did it. she added the final payment from that year, a large sum, clearly from the sale of a significant portion of their livestock. She did the final subtraction, and then she stopped. She stared at the number on the page. It couldn't be right. Her mind, exhausted and overworked, must have made a mistake. She went back, checking her own additions, her own subtractions. Her heart pounded, a slow, heavy rhythm in the quiet room. The scratching of her pencil was the only sound as she recalculated. The numbers remained the same. She checked them a third time, her breath held tight in her chest. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale, ethereal glow into the kitchen. The lamplight now looked sickly and yellow in comparison. Outside, the first birds began to sing, their cheerful calls a jarring contrast to the cold dread and hot fury coiling in her stomach. She looked at the final line on her shadow ledger. The number was not a balance owed. It was a negative number, a surplus. Ellie's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp that was half a soom, half a scream. Her body began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that started in her hands and spread through her entire frame. The pencil dropped from her numb fingers, rolling silently across the table. It was over. The debt was gone. She realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating that the original loan, along with all its legitimate interest, had been fully paid off 7 years ago. Every single dollar, every penny that Jake and his father had paid since that day had been theft. For 7 long years, Silas Blackwood had been collecting on a ghost debt. He had taken their harvests, their livestock, their hope. He had kept Jake a prisoner on his own land, shackled by a lie. The humiliation Jake had endured, the endless worry, the slumped shoulders, the light that had gone out in his eyes, it was all for nothing. It was all built on a foundation of pure, calculated greed. Ellie stared at her work, at the 2 ledgers sitting side by side on the kitchen table. One was a monument to a lie. The other was the weapon that would bring it all crashing down. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, not of sadness, but of a rage so profound it felt holy. She had found the monster that was haunting this farm, and it had a name. It was Silas Blackwood. The first pale light of dawn crept through the kitchen window, turning the dark room gray. It found Eleanor Vance sitting at the table, a single oil lamp still burning beside her. The warm yellow flame cast long shadows that danced on the walls. In front of her lay the farm's old, cracked ledger. Beside it, stacked in a neat, defiant pile, were several sheets of paper covered in her own precise handwriting. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, spent lamp oil, and the fresh coffee she had brewed an hour ago, now cold in its pot. She was bone-tired, her eyes gritty from a night without sleep. Yet she had never felt more awake. A cold, hard certainty had settled deep in her stomach, a feeling as solid and unmovable as a block of winter ice. She heard the familiar scrape of boots on the back porch, followed by the soft groan of the kitchen door. Jacob Miller stepped inside, bringing the crisp morning air with him. He moved with the slow, deliberate exhaustion of a man who had already done hours of work before the sun had fully risen. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw her first, then the lamp, then the fortress of paper she had built on the table. A frown creased his brow, a flicker of tired confusion. He had left that ledger on the table in a moment of defeat. He never expected her to touch it, let alone to spend the night with it. For a moment he said nothing. He just looked at the scene, at her pale face and the intense, unnerving focus in her eyes. He ran a hand through his damp hair, his shoulders slumping. He looked like a man bracing for another blow, even if he did not know where it was coming from. Ellie's voice was quiet when she finally spoke, but it cut through the silence of the room. "Jake, please sit down." He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the open ledger. It was a physical manifestation of his life's burden, and seeing her with it felt like a violation. It felt as if she had opened a door into the most private, shameful corner of his soul. He wanted to tell her to close the book, to put it away, to leave his failures alone. But the command in her voice was not unkind. It was urgent. He slowly pulled out the chair opposite her and sank into it, his work-roughened hands resting on his knees. She took a deep breath, marshaling her thoughts. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the dark, silent hours of the night. She knew she could not simply blurt out the truth. It was too vast, too shocking. It would break him. She had to build a bridge for him, a bridge of numbers and logic, from his world of despair to her world of facts. I looked at the books, Jake, she began, her voice steady. She pushed the old ledger slightly toward him, then laid one of her own pages beside it. I started with the most recent entries. There were small mistakes, interest calculations that were just slightly off, always in Blackwood's favor. Jake stared at her pages of neat columns and tidy script. He did not look at the numbers. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. It's complicated accounting, Ellie. It's easy to make a mistake. His tone was dismissive, defensive. It was the voice of a man defending his own cage. A few mistakes, yes, she agreed, keeping her voice calm. But the mistakes are always the same. They always benefit him. Never you. She slid another sheet of paper forward. Then I went back further. 5 years, 10 years. The errors got bigger. He was charging you compound interest on penalties that were calculated incorrectly in the first place. He was adding fees that are not mentioned anywhere in the original loan agreement your father signed. Her finger traced a line on her own paper, then pointed to a corresponding entry in the old book. Look, here, he charged a late fee, and then the next month he calculated the interest on the entire loan amount plus the fee. That's not how it's supposed to work. The interest should only be on the principal. Jake squinted at the ledger, then shook his head, pushing it away slightly. I don't know about things like that. My father handled it, then I handled it. We pay what Silas Blackwood tells us we owe. That's the deal. Ellie felt a surge of frustration, hot and sharp. He was not listening. He was refusing to see. It's not a deal, Jake. It's theft. He has been systematically overcharging you for years. The word theft made him flinch. He sat up straighter, his jaw tightening. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice low and tight. You've been here a few weeks. You don't know Blackwood. You don't know how this town works. You can't just throw words like that around. He could ruin us. He is ruining you, she countered, her voice rising despite her efforts to control it. He has been for 15 years. This was it, the moment she had dreaded. She took her final, meticulously prepared page and laid it on top of the others. It contained only 2 columns and a few lines of text. The heading on the first column read, Total Paid. The heading on the second read, Actual Debt with Fair Interest. Jake, she said, her voice dropping again, becoming softer, more pleading. I spent all night checking every single payment you and your father ever made. I recalculated the entire loan from the very first day. The original amount plus a generous interest rate, far more generous than the bank would have given. She paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched his face, saw the walls of fear and denial rising in his eyes. He was already shaking his head, preparing to reject whatever she was about to say. Jake, listen to me, she said, leaning forward. The debt was paid, completely. You paid off the entire loan 7 years ago. Silence. The clock on the mantelpiece seemed to tick louder, each second a hammer blow in the stillness. Jake stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He looked not relieved, but horrified. It was as if she had told him the sky was green, that the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. No, he whispered. The word was barely audible. No, that's not possible. It is, she insisted, pushing the paper closer to him. Look at the numbers. They don't lie. Everything you have paid in the last 7 years, every single dollar, has been pure profit for him. He's not your lender, Jake. He's a thief who has been picking your pocket every month for almost a decade. He shot to his feet, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that eclipsed his exhaustion. Stop it, he shouted, his voice cracking. Just stop! You think you can come in here and understand a lifetime of debt by scribbling on a piece of paper for one night? He began to pace the small space between the table and the hearth, his hands clenched into fists. This is my father's debt, my responsibility. I have given my life to paying it, my whole life. Do you think I'm a fool? Do you think my father was a fool? That we would just hand over money for nothing? No, I think you were cheated, Ellie cried, standing as well. I think you were lied to by a man you trusted. You're going to get us thrown off this land, he raged, turning on her. His fear had curdled into a desperate anger. Blackwood finds out you're making these accusations. He'll call in the whole loan. He'll say we've defaulted. He'll take the farm, Ellie. He'll take everything. Is that what you want? To make us homeless because you wanted to play with numbers you don't understand? The accusation hit her like a slap. All her life, her intelligence with numbers had been her only asset, the one thing she could rely on. For him to throw it back in her face as a childish game, it broke through her composure. I don't play with numbers, Jacob, she said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. I understand them. I understand them better than Blackwood does, because he has to lie and cheat to make them work for him. I just have to tell the truth. Truth, he scoffed, a bitter, desperate laugh escaping his lips. There is no truth. There is only what Silas Blackwood says is true. You have made things worse. You have put us in terrible danger for nothing. He turned away from her, running a hand over his face. He looked utterly broken. The hope she had foolishly imagined he would feel was nowhere to be seen. All she had done was add a new, terrible weight to the one he already carried. The weight of her accusation, the weight of her dangerous knowledge. He looked at the door to the barn as if he was about to flee, to run from her and the impossible truth she was trying to force upon him. He was shutting down, retreating back into the familiar prison of his despair. She knew she had one last chance to reach him. One last piece of evidence, so absolute, so undeniable that not even his 15 years of ingrained fear could refute it. Wait, she said. Her voice was sharp, cutting through his panic and halting him in his tracks. He turned slowly, his expression wary and exhausted. Ellie's hand moved from her papers to the old, battered ledger. She opened it to a page near the middle, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. Her finger, shaking almost imperceptibly, landed on a single line written in Blackwood's precise, elegant script. It was dated from 8 years ago. Here, she said quietly, this entry, August, payment missed. Full penalty applied. Do you remember this? Jake's face clouded over. He nodded slowly, a deep, painful memory surfacing. My father, he said, his voice thick. He was sick that summer. Very sick. We barely got the harvest in. We were late with the payment. It cost us. Blackwood said it nearly doubled what we owed. The shame of that failure was still fresh, a wound that had never healed. It was the moment the debt had transformed from a manageable burden into an impossible mountain. He had always believed that single mistake had sealed their fate. You were late, Ellie confirmed softly, but you didn't miss it. Jake just stared at her, his confusion warring with his remembered pain. What are you talking about? Of course we missed it. It says so right there. The ledger says you missed it, she corrected him. But the ledger lies. Her hand went to the pocket of her apron. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was creased and fragile, the color of old ivory. The ink on it was faded but still legible. As she moved, the scent of old, dry paper and something else, something like dried flowers in reverence, filled the air. When I was looking for the receipts, she explained, her eyes locked on his, I couldn't find the one for that August. I searched the entire office. Then I remembered seeing your mother put your father's things away after he passed. I looked in the chest at the foot of your bed. She unfolded the paper with delicate care and laid it on the table, right next to the damning entry in the ledger. She kept his Bible, and tucked inside the front cover was this. It was a receipt from Blackwood's Lending and Mercantile. It was signed by Blackwood's clerk in a hurried, scratchy hand, and it was dated August 28th, the very year the ledger claimed the payment had been missed entirely. It was proof of payment in full, proof that the catastrophic penalty, the one that had broken his father's spirit and chained Jake to this land, was built on a deliberate, cruel lie. To silence him, Ellie pointed from the line in the ledger, payment missed, penalty applied, to the faded but undeniable signature on the receipt. Jake's eyes followed her finger. The room was utterly still. The only sound was the frantic, desperate pounding of his own heart. He saw the date. He saw the amount. He saw the signature. And he saw the lie. The receipt lay on the worn oak table like a judgment. It was a small, creased rectangle of paper, insignificant against the vast, cracked leather of the ledger. But for Jacob Miller, it was the anchor point of a world that was beginning to fracture. His eyes were fixed on it, tracing the elegant, confident loops of Silas Blackwood's signature. He could feel the grain of the wood under his fingertips, the faint coolness of the morning air still lingering in the kitchen. The smell of coffee had gone stale. The only sound was the frantic, trapped beat of his own heart. He had lived his entire adult life by the rules written in that ledger. Every number was a stone in the wall of his obligations. Every payment was a pound of flesh, dutifully rendered in his father's name. He had carried the weight of his father's final, desperate decision like a penance. He had sacrificed the possibility of a wife, a family, of any life beyond the dirt and the debt. It was his duty. It was his honor. His entire identity was built upon the foundation of that unending, honorable struggle. And now, this small piece of paper, this receipt. His hand, calloused and brown from the sun, trembled as he reached for it. He didn't pick it up. He just touched its edge, as if to confirm it was real. Payment missed, penalty applied. The words in the ledger were a brand on his memory. He remembered that month clearly. A late frost had damaged the early wheat crop. He had sold two of their best milking cows at a loss just to make the payment. He had walked to town, his stomach in knots, and handed the cash to Blackwood himself. He remembered the condescending smile on the man's face. He remembered the feeling of failure as he walked home with empty pockets. Yet here was the proof, a receipt, signed and dated, tucked away in his father's Bible, a book of truths. It had been there all along. The payment had not been missed. The penalty was a lie, a simple, cruel, and profitable lie. A tremor started in his hand and worked its way up his arm. It was not a shiver from cold. It was the deep, seismic shudder of a man's world breaking apart. 15 years. 15 years of his youth, his strength, his hope. 15 years of his father's shame and his own inherited despair. Poured into a hole that had been filled long ago. The shame he had carried for so long began to curdle, to sour. It twisted into something else, something hot and unfamiliar. It was rage, a profound, silent rage that felt like it was cracking his ribs from the inside. He thought of his father, a good man who had worked himself into an early grave, believing he had failed his son. He saw his father's tired face, the stoop in his shoulders, the quiet apology in his eyes. He had died thinking he had doomed his family, and Blackwood had let him. Blackwood had watched him wither, all while collecting money that wasn't his. The rage burned hotter, scorching away the years of resignation. He thought of every humiliation, every time Blackwood's man had come to the farm, counting out the money with a sneer. Every whispered comment in town. Every time he had looked at his own worn hands and felt like a fool, a peasant tied to the land by a debt he could never conquer. He had believed it was his own failing, his own weakness. He finally pushed his chair back from the table. The screech of the wood against the floorboards was violent in the stillness. He stood up, his body tight as a coiled spring. For a long moment he stared at the wall, seeing nothing. He was seeing 15 stolen years, a lifetime of sweat and worry for nothing, for a ghost debt, for a rich man's ledger trick. The air in his lungs felt like fire. He wanted to smash something. He wanted to roar until the window shattered. He wanted to ride into town and what? The thought died, choked by a lifetime of powerlessness. Then slowly he turned his head. He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time he truly saw her. She was not just the woman from the advertisement, the stranger who had come to share his broken life. She was not just a pair of hands to help with chores, a quiet presence in his house. In this moment, she was the starkest, clearest thing in his blurred and broken world. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded on top of her own neat pages of calculations. The morning light from the window caught the red in her auburn hair, turning it to fire. Her blue eyes were not soft or pitying. They were clear, intelligent, and filled with a fierce, steady light. They were the eyes of a fighter. He saw the methodical precision in her handwritten columns. He saw the sharp, analytical mind that had cut through 15 years of deception in a single night. He had been drowning in that ocean of numbers for his entire life, and she had simply walked to the shore, pointed, and shown him it was only an illusion. She had not come here to be his wife. She had come here to be his salvation. The burning shame he had felt when she first arrived, the shame of offering her this poor, indebted life, vanished. It was replaced by something else entirely. A wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. She had looked into the heart of his failure, the very thing he had tried to hide from her, and she had not run. She had not judged him. She had picked up his weapon, the ledger that had been used against him, and she had turned it back on his enemy. He sank back into his chair, the rage not gone, but banked now, tempered into something cold and hard, like steel. He looked from her face to her notes, to the damning receipt. He reached out and his rough, dirt-caked fingers brushed against hers where they rested on the table. It was a simple touch, but it was everything. It was an apology. It was a thank you. It was a plea. Ellie did not pull her hand away. Her fingers turned slightly, a small, accepting pressure against his. He counted on you never checking, she said, her voice quiet but without a trace of pity. It was a statement of fact. He counted on you being too honorable and too tired to question the numbers. Jake swallowed, his throat dry. My father, he said, his voice a rough whisper. He trusted him. The words were full of a fresh, sharp grief. His father hadn't just been cheated. His trust, his good name, had been weaponized against his own son. He did, Ellie affirmed, her gaze unwavering. And you honored your father by continuing that trust. There is no shame in that, Jake. The shame belongs to Silas Blackwood, and him alone. Her words were a balm on a wound he hadn't known was festering. All his life, he had conflated the debt with his father's legacy. To question one was to dishonor the other. But Ellie had separated them. The honor was in the trying, in the sacrifice. The crime was in the deception. They sat there for a long time, the space between them no longer a chasm of unspoken secrets, but a bridge built of shared truth. The kitchen table was no longer just for meals. It was a council of war. He was not a broken farmer, and she was not a mail-order bride. They were partners. A new feeling began to take root in the scorched earth of his anger. Hope. It was a terrifying, fragile thing. 7 years, Jake said, the number tasting like ash in his mouth. We've been paying him for 7 years for nothing. He looked at the neatly stacked pile of coins on the mantelpiece. This month's payment, ready for collection. The sight of it made him sick. More than that, Ellie said, tapping a final column on her summary page. With the penalties and the compounded interest he added illegally, he has taken more than 3 times the original loan amount from this farm. This farm, she repeated, her voice gaining a sharp edge, is yours. It has been for years. He is a trespasser every time he sends a man to your door. A trespasser. The word landed in Jake's mind and took hold. Blackwood was not his master. He was not his benefactor. He was a common thief, dressed in a fine suit. What do we do? Jake asked. The question was not one of despair. It was practical. For the first time, he felt he was on solid ground, ready to take a step. He was asking for direction, not for salvation. He was asking his partner. Ellie's eyes met his. The fierceness in them was now directed outward, a shared weapon. We do not pay him, she said, her voice low and firm. Not 1 more cent. The thought was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. To simply refuse. After 15 years of obedience, it felt like an act of impossible rebellion. He'll send his man. He'll try to take the farm. Let him try, Ellie said, and the conviction in her voice was absolute. He can't take what is already yours. His claim is based on fraud. The numbers prove it. She slid her his notes across the table, placing them directly in front of him. This is our proof. This is our story. We have every payment, every false penalty, every inflated interest charge. It's all here. Jake looked down at the pages. It was a different kind of ledger. Not a book of doom, but a book of reckoning. He felt a surge of energy, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The weariness in his bones seemed to recede. He won't just listen to us, Jake said, thinking of Blackwood's cold, dismissive eyes. He'll laugh in our faces. He owns the town. The sheriff. Everyone is afraid of him. I know, Ellie agreed. A man like that doesn't listen to reason. He only listens to power. We can't fight him with just anger or even with the truth alone. She paused, her gaze intense. We have to use his own world against him. We need to fight him with the law. The word hung in the air between them. The law. It felt like a foreign concept, something for other people in other places. Here, in Prosperity, Blackwood was the law. A lawyer, Jake said, the word feeling strange on his tongue. It sounded expensive. It sounded dangerous. It meant taking their private battle and making it public. It meant declaring war openly. There would be no turning back. A good one, Ellie specified. Someone who can't be bought. Someone who sees these numbers and understands the crime that has been committed. Jake thought about it. He imagined walking into a lawyer's office, laying out these papers. He imagined the letter that would be sent to Silas Blackwood. He could almost feel the man's cold fury reaching all the way out here to the farm. Blackwood would not take this lying down. He would retaliate. He would try to crush them before they could even get to a courtroom. The hope that had bloomed just moments before was now edged with a very real, very cold fear. His land, his home, Ellie. They would all be targets. He looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt. He found none. She was resolute. She had faced her own past and come out the other side, and she was not afraid to face his future. Her courage gave him his. He had spent his life fighting a losing battle alone. Now he would not be alone. He nodded, a single decisive movement. All right, he said, and his own voice sounded stronger than he could ever remember it being. We find a lawyer. The decision was made. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, streaming through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, the world was the same. A bird sang. The wind whispered through the tall grass. But inside the small farmhouse, everything had changed. The farmer and his mail-order bride sat at their table, the evidence of a 15-year lie between them. They were no longer victims. They were conspirators, allies bound by a shared, righteous anger and the dawning promise of a future that was truly their own. They knew that seeking a lawyer was like lighting a fuse. It would draw the wrath of the most powerful man they knew directly down upon them. But for the first time in a very long time, Jacob Miller was not afraid of the fight. The morning air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth. Jake stood by the wagon, his hands checking harnesses he had already checked twice. His movements were stiff, his face a new mask of resolve. Ellie came out of the house, her steps firm on the porch. She carried 2 old ledgers wrapped carefully in oilcloth, holding the bundle against her chest like a child. It held their past and their only possible future. Jake stopped his fidgeting and looked at her. The chasm of secrets that had separated them was gone, replaced by a fragile bridge of shared purpose. He reached out to help her onto the wagon seat, his calloused hand briefly covering hers. The touch was a silent promise. We do this together. They chose not to go to Prosperity, where Blackwood's shadow was too long. Instead, they took the rougher track toward Crestwood, a town 1 county over. They hoped its distance might offer a lawyer who did not owe his livelihood to Silas Blackwood. For hours, the only sounds were the clip, clop of the horses and the sigh of the wind. Jake held the reins, his knuckles white. He was replaying a lifetime of humiliation, now recast in the harsh light of betrayal. He had thought he was honoring his father's debt. Instead, he had been helping Blackwood rob his father's grave. Ellie sat beside him, the oilcloth bundle heavy on her lap. She had escaped a life where clever men used numbers to trap people. She would not be broken by the same kind of predator here. Crestwood was larger than Prosperity, with a brick-paved main street. They found the lawyer's office easily. A polished brass plaque read, Lawrence Davies, Attorney at Law. Inside, the room was orderly, smelling of lemon polish and expensive paper. Mr. Davies was a man in his 50s with a reassuring smile. He gestured for them to sit. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, he began smoothly. What can I do for you today? Jake cleared his throat but looked at Ellie, deferring to her. She placed the bundle on the corner of the pristine desk. Mr. Davies, we need legal counsel regarding a loan, she started, her voice clear. A loan held by Mr. Silas Blackwood. The moment the name left her lips, the room's temperature dropped. The lawyer's smile no longer reached his eyes. Silas Blackwood, he repeated slowly, a very successful man, a pillar of the region. He is also a thief, Ellie said, her composure unwavering. She slid her notes across the polished wood. This farm loan was paid in full over 7 years ago. According to Mr. Blackwood's own receipts, we have been overpaying ever since. The fraud amounts to thousands of dollars. Davies picked up a sheet, his eyes skating over the numbers without reading them. Ma'am, he said, with condescending patience, loan agreements can be quite complex. It's very easy for a laywoman to misunderstand the figures. I was a bookkeeper for 5 years in Boston, Ellie replied, her voice turning sharp as glass. I do not misunderstand figures. She pushed a small, folded receipt toward him, proof of a penalty that should never have been applied. He did not look at it. Clerical errors happen, he said with a dismissive wave. I'm sure if you approach him politely, he would be happy to clarify any discrepancies. Jake, who had been silent, finally spoke. He's been stealing from my family for 15 years, he said, his voice low and raw. Davies sighed, the picture of a patient man dealing with irrational people. Mr. Miller, Silas Blackwood is one of the most respected men in this state. He has deep connections. In business, in politics, and in law. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the mahogany desk. My advice is to go home, burn these papers, forget this had ever happened. The silence was absolute. The hope that had flickered in Ellie's chest was extinguished. She calmly gathered her papers, wrapped the oilcloth around the ledgers, and retied the twine. Her fingers did not tremble. She stood, and Jake, looking utterly defeated, followed her out of the office. The ride back was a journey through a desolate landscape of failure. After an hour, Jake finally spoke, his voice raspy. I told you, Ellie, it was no use. Now he knows we're looking. Ellie stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. The lawyer's dismissal had not broken her. It had tempered her anger into something harder. Steal. No, she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. He didn't tell us it's no use. He told us where the battlefront is. It's in Prosperity. What are you talking about? Jake asked, his voice laced with despair. There's no one left. The sheriff, the mayor, they all belong to him. The lawyer, Ellie said simply. Jake let out a short, bitter laugh. Arthur Finch? Ellie, he's a joke. He hasn't won a real case in 20 years. Then we'll make him listen, she insisted. It's a desperate chance, but it's better than no chance at all. He looked at her then, at the fierce, unwavering line of her mouth. He was terrified, but a dangerous hope flickered within him. He simply turned his eyes to the road and tightened his grip on the reins. They reached Prosperity as dusk settled. On one side of the street, Blackwood's imposing office was dark. On the other, a rickety staircase ran up the outside of the general store. A small, faded sign hung above a door. Arthur Finch, attorney. Each step on the wooden stairs creaked in protest. The air grew stale, thick with dust and neglect. Ellie knocked. The door opened a few inches, revealing a man with thinning gray hair and a rumpled suit. We're closed, Arthur Finch said, his voice gravelly. He started to shut the door. Mr. Finch, Ellie said quickly, we need your help. He peered at them through the crack. Son, whatever trouble you're in, I can't help you. This town has rules. The first rule is you don't cross Silas Blackwood. He tried to close the door again. Jake looked down, ready to accept the dismissal, but Ellie did not move. Mr. Blackwood is systematically robbing us, she stated, her tone factual. And we have the proof. Finch snorted. Proof, lady. In Prosperity, Silas Blackwood's word is worth more than proof. Go home. He began to push the door closed for a final time, but Ellie's voice cut through the dusty air, sharp and clear. We are not going home. We are not going to be silent, and we are not leaving this doorway. Finch stopped. He opened the door wider and looked at her properly for the first time. He saw a bedrock of resolve he had not encountered in decades. It was cold, intelligent, and utterly determined. He looked from her unwavering eyes to the beaten-down farmer behind her, and then back to this woman who refused to quit. A faint curiosity stirred in him. He let out a long sigh, a sound of profound weariness. All right, he grumbled, stepping back and opening the door all the way. The room behind him was a disaster of stacked books and paper. "Show me your numbers." He peered at her over his spectacles, a flicker of something that was no longer apathy in his eyes. This had better be good. The air in Arthur Finch's office was heavy with the smell of old paper and dust. Sunlight struggled through a grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes and thick golden shafts. Stacks of books and legal documents leaned against each other, forming precarious towers that threatened to collapse at any moment. Jake stood stiffly by the door, his hat clutched in his hands, looking as out of place as a field horse in a library. He was a solid, unmovable statue of anxiety. Ellie sat in the worn leather chair opposite the lawyer's desk, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. On the desk between them lay the old Miller Farm ledger and her own meticulously crafted pages of notes. They were a map of 15 years of deception. Finch sighed, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He picked up one of Ellie's pages. His spectacles were perched low on his nose, and his skeptical gaze flickered over the columns of figures. He had the weary look of a man who had heard too many sob stories and seen too many good people lose. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment their fragile hope would either be validated or extinguished by this cynical, tired man. She watched his eyes, searching for any flicker of understanding. For the first few minutes, there was nothing, just the quiet scratch of his fingernail against the paper, the soft rustle as he turned a page. Jake shifted his weight by the door, the floorboards creaking in the suffocating silence. "Every farmer in this valley thinks they're being cheated, Mrs. Vance," Finch murmured, not looking up. His voice was gravelly, disinterested. "It's the nature of debt. It feels like a monster that's always eating and never full." Ellie did not respond. She let her work speak for her. She had poured all her fury, all her need for justice into those numbers. They were cold, hard, and undeniable. She had checked them 100 times. They were the truth. Finch picked up the original ledger, his thin fingers tracing the faded ink of Jake's father's handwriting. He compared it to Ellie's notes, then back again. A faint frown line appeared between his eyebrows. He was no longer just glancing. He was reading. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, and the stripes of light on the floor shifted. Finch said nothing. He worked with a quiet intensity that slowly filled the room. He would pause, make a small calculation on a scrap piece of paper, and then let out a soft, almost inaudible grunt. Jake's posture had not changed, but Ellie could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his jaw. He was a man braced for another blow, another dismissal. He expected to be told he was a fool, that he had imagined it all. He had lived under the weight of this lie for so long, it had become a part of his identity. Ellie felt a surge of protectiveness for him. She wanted to reach across the room and tell him to breathe. Finally, Finch leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He took off his spectacles and rubbed his tired eyes. He stared at Ellie for a long, silent moment. The cynicism in his gaze was gone. It was replaced by something else, something she couldn't quite name. It was a look of pure professional astonishment. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice quiet. "In 30 years of practice, I've seen petty cheats and strong-arm tactics. I've seen foreclosures based on lies. But this?" He trailed off, shaking his head slowly. He tapped a finger on one of Ellie's pages. "This is a masterpiece." Jake took a half step forward. "A masterpiece of what?" he asked, his voice rough. Finch looked at him, his eyes sharp and clear now. "A masterpiece of fraud, Mr. Miller. It's elegant. It's patient. It's systemic." He picked up the two ledgers, one in each hand, as if weighing them. "Blackwood didn't just rob your father. He built a cage of numbers around him, and then around you. A cage where the bars get thicker every time you make a payment." He explained it to them then, not in Ellie's furious rush of discovery, but with the cold, methodical precision of the law. He pointed out the compound interest miscalculations. He showed them where penalties were applied for payments that had, according to the receipts Ellie found, been made on time. He walked them through the slow, deliberate bleed, a few dollars here, a few dollars there, compounding over 15 years into a fortune. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. According to your wife's calculations, Finch said, looking directly at Ellie with newfound respect, the original loan plus a generous amount of legal interest was paid in full 7 years ago. Everything you've paid since, every single dollar, has been theft. The word hung in the air. Theft. Jake visibly flinched as if he had been struck. All those years of back-breaking work, all those seasons of worrying about hail and drought and market prices, all that time spent scraping together every penny, denying himself every small comfort, all for a debt that didn't exist. It was not just money that had been stolen. It was his life, his youth, his father's final years. Tears welled in Jake's eyes, hot and shameful. He quickly turned his head towards the window, but it was too late. Ellie saw them. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a deep, profound rage finally breaking through the surface of his despair. Finch let the silence sit for a moment, allowing the weight of the truth to settle. "This is a strong case," he said finally, his tone shifting. It was no longer weary, it was energized. The old lawyer was gone, replaced by a fighter who had just been handed a perfect weapon. "The documentation is pristine. Mrs. Vance, your bookkeeping is impeccable. It's not just an accusation. It's a narrative. It's proof." A flicker of hope, bright and terrifying, ignited in Ellie's chest. "So we can fight him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Finch's face became grim. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. The energy in the room changed again, from excitement to cold, hard reality. "We can fight him," he confirmed, "and with this evidence, I believe we can win. But you need to understand what you're asking." He looked from Ellie to Jake, his gaze unflinching. "You are not just accusing a man of a crime. You are trying to tear down the king of this entire valley. Silas Blackwood doesn't just own the mercantile. He owns the sheriff. He has men on his payroll who are not afraid of the law because they think he is the law." He let that sink in. "If we file this suit, he will not take it lying down. He will not wait for a judge. He will come after you. Not with lawyers, not at first. He will try to break you. He will threaten you, your farm, your livestock. He will try to burn you out, starve you out, or scare you out. He will make your life a living hell to convince you to drop the case before it ever sees a courtroom." Finch's voice was low and serious. "He has done it before. People who cross Silas Blackwood have a habit of having very bad luck. Fires, accidents. Sometimes they just pack up in the middle of the night and disappear." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool, dusty air of the office. She looked at Jake. He had turned back from the window, his face pale, the tears gone. In their place was a hard, resolute expression she had never seen on him before. The beaten man was gone. "My father died believing he was a failure," Jake said, his voice steady and clear. "He died in debt to that man, thinking he had lost our family's legacy. I've spent my whole life trying to pay for his mistake." He looked at Ellie, and a world of gratitude passed between them. "And now I know the only mistake he made was trusting the wrong person. What Blackwood did to him, what he did to me, I can't let that stand." He turned back to Finch. "Tell us what to do." A slow smile spread across Arthur Finch's face. It was the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of its own kind. "All right," he said. "First, I'll need to officially draft the complaint. It will take a few days. I will file it with the circuit judge in Helena, not here. We can't trust the local magistrate." He pushed a stack of papers aside. "Go home. Act as normal. Don't talk to anyone about this. Not a soul. When Blackwood gets word you were here, and he will, he'll be watching you. Let him wonder." They left Finch's office and stepped back out into the bright, dusty street. The world looked different. The fear was still there, a cold knot in Ellie's stomach, but it was no longer the shapeless dread of the unknown. It now had a name and a face, and they had a plan to fight it. As they untied their horse from the hitching post, Ellie saw a man across the street pause and watch them. He was one of the men who often sat outside the saloon, one of Blackwood's men. He tipped his hat slowly, a gesture that was not friendly. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of marking a target. Word was already spreading. The ride home was quiet. The vast sky and the golden plains seemed to hold their breath. Jake rode tall in the saddle, his profile set against the horizon like a man carved from stone. The shame that had stooped his shoulders for years was gone, burned away by the clean fire of righteous anger. Ellie rode beside him, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. They had crossed a line. There was no going back to the quiet despair of before. They were now in open rebellion. That night, after a silent supper, they stood on the porch together. The farm was quiet, the air cool and smelling of hay and dry earth. For the first time, it felt truly like their home, a thing worth fighting for. Jake reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapped around hers, his touch firm and steady. He didn't say anything, but his eyes, looking down at her, were full of a deep, profound emotion that went beyond gratitude. It was a look of partnership, of trust, of love. In that quiet moment, Ellie knew she was no longer just a mail-order bride seeking refuge. She was a defender of this home. She was Jake's partner in a war they had to win. A sense of peace settled over her, a feeling that, despite the danger, they were finally on the right path. Jake squeezed her hand gently before letting it go. "I need to check on the animals one last time before turning in," he said, his voice soft. He gave her a small, tired smile and walked towards the barn, his steps sure and steady in the fading twilight. Ellie watched him go, a warmth spreading through her chest. She remained on the porch, listening to the chirping of crickets, feeling the first real stirrings of hope for their future. A few minutes later, a sound broke the evening calm. It was not a loud sound, but it was sharp and unnatural. A choked gasp. Ellie's head snapped up. She saw Jake standing frozen at the entrance to the barn, his silhouette framed against the dark opening. He didn't move. He just stared. A cold dread washed over her, extinguishing the warmth of a moment before. She ran from the porch, her boots kicking up dust, her heart pounding in her throat. "Jake? What is it? What's wrong?" He didn't answer. As she got closer, she could see what held him captive. There on the large, weathered wood of the barn door was a dark shape. Pinned to the center of the door by a single large nail driven through its body was a hawk. Its wings were spread wide, its head lolled to one side, its sharp eyes now glassy and dead. It was a predator, slain and displayed. It was not just a threat, it was a promise, a clear and terrifying message from Silas Blackwood. The dead hawk was gone by morning. Jake had taken it down with a grim set to his jaw, his movements stiff and angry. He had buried it far from the house, but its phantom presence remained. For 3 days, a tense silence filled the homestead, thicker than the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. They moved around each other, carefully. The unspoken threat, a third person in the room. Every creak of the floorboards at night was a footstep. Every gust of wind rattling the window panes was a hand on the latch. Ellie found herself holding her breath, her ears straining against the quiet of the plains. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, and the waiting was a form of torture all its own. Jake spent his nights oiling his father's old rifle, the metallic scrape and click, a rhythmic counterpoint to the crickets outside. He would sit at the kitchen table, the lamp casting long shadows that made his face seem older, harder. He rarely spoke of the hawk or of Blackwood. He didn't need to. His fear was a scent in the air, sharp and metallic like blood. Ellie would watch him, her heart a tight knot in her chest. She saw the protector in him warring with the man who had been beaten down for 15 years. She knew he was terrified, not just for the farm, but for her. This was a danger he had never imagined bringing into his home, into his life, and it was a danger she had brought to his door. The night it happened, the air was still and moonless, wrapped in a blanket of suffocating black. Sleep was a shallow, restless thing. Ellie was woken not by a sound, but by a flicker of unnatural light against her eyelids. A strange dancing orange pulsed against her closed curtains. For a moment, she thought it was a trick of a stray candle. Then the smell hit her. It was faint at first, a bitter tang of smoke that pricked at the back of her throat. Her eyes snapped open. The room was bathed in a hellish, wavering glow. She threw off the blankets and ran to the window. The sight stole the air from her lungs. Flames were clawing their way up the side of the hay barn. They weren't just burning, they were devouring. The fire moved with a hungry, living malice, licking at the dry timber, sending a geyser of sparks into the dark sky. She could hear it now, a low, greedy roar that grew louder with every second. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She didn't scream. Her mind, trained for crisis, went numbly clear. She grabbed her robe and burst from her room just as Jake came stumbling out of his face pale in the flickering light. His eyes were wide with a horror she had never seen before. "No," he breathed, the word a ragged whisper of disbelief. But there was no time for shock. The panicked whinnies of the horses and the lowing of the cattle from inside the main barn shattered the night. The fire was in the attached hayloft, a mountain of dry fuel that would turn the entire structure into an inferno within minutes. "The animals," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Jake nodded, his paralysis breaking. He grabbed a heavy axe from beside the door. "Get the buckets, fill them at the well, just keep them coming." They burst out into the night air. The heat hit them like a physical blow, a wave of scorching intensity that made the cool night air feel like a distant memory. The roar of the fire was deafening now, a monstrous, elemental sound. Jake sprinted towards the large barn doors, not the ones engulfed in flame, but the main entrance. Ellie ran for the well, her bare feet pounding against the cool, hard-packed earth. Her hands worked the pump handle with a frantic, desperate energy. The rhythmic squeak and splash of water filling the first wooden bucket was the only sound she could focus on. She hauled the heavy bucket, water sloshing over the sides, and ran toward the blaze. Jake had managed to wrench the main doors open. The interior was a chaotic scene of shadows and smoke. The livestock, their eyes wide with terror, were bucking and pulling against their tethers. He moved among them with a practiced calm, his voice a low murmur, trying to soothe their panic even as he worked to free them. Ellie arrived at his white tie, handing him a wet cloth. "For the smoke!" she yelled over the roar. He took it without a word, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. In that glance, she saw a universe of fear, fury, and a desperate, burning gratitude. They were no longer two separate people. They were a single unit, moving and thinking as one. She began her relentless cycle. To the well, pump, haul, run. To the barn, soak the walls, douse the flying embers. Run back. The smoke was a thick, acrid beast clawing at her lungs, making her eyes stream with tears. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. But she didn't stop. Jake worked inside, a silhouette against the orange glow, leading the horses out one by one into the paddock, their bodies slick with sweat and trembling. He unlatched the cattle stalls, driving the small herd out into the relative safety of the open field. Ellie focused her efforts on the wall connecting the hayloft to the main barn. If they could keep that wall wet, keep it from catching, they might save the main structure. She threw bucket after bucket of water against the hot wood, which hissed and steamed on contact. The heat was blistering, charring the fabric of her dress, singeing the loose strands of her hair. Sparks rained down around her like malicious fireflies. One landed on her sleeve, and she beat it out with her hand without even flinching. There was no pain, only the fire and the water and the desperate need to win. Jake joined her, having freed the last of the animals. They formed a frantic, silent brigade. He would pump, she would carry, he would take the next bucket. Back and forth, they moved in a grim, synchronized dance. The fire raged, a wild beast fighting their every effort. A section of the hayloft roof collapsed inwards with a deafening crash, sending a shower of embers high into the air. It felt hopeless. The fire was too big, too powerful. They were just two people with two buckets against a dragon. Ellie's vision started to blur from smoke and exhaustion. Her lungs burned. Every breath was an agony. She stumbled, the heavy bucket slipping from her grasp. Before she could fall, Jake's arm was around her waist, holding her steady. "Ellie," he said, his voice rough with smoke and concern. "You need to stop." She shook her head, pushing herself upright. "No, we can't." She looked at the flames, her face illuminated by their terrible light. This wasn't just a fire. It was a message. It was Blackwood's answer to their visit to the lawyer. It was his hand, reaching out to burn their hope to the ground. The thought sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through her veins. It was not just anger. It was a cold, hard fury that burned hotter than the flames in front of them. They fought for what felt like an eternity. They fought until the roar of the fire began to quiet, until the ravenous orange flames shrank into sullen, glowing red pockets. They fought until the black of night began to soften into the gray of pre-dawn. Finally, the beast was tamed, not defeated, but exhausted. It smoldered and smoked, its hunger sated. The hayloft was gone. A blackened skeletal frame stood against the lightening sky, wisps of greasy smoke curling from the charred timbers. But the main barn, though scorched and waterlogged, was still standing. The house was untouched. The animals were safe. They stood together in the eerie morning light, their bodies aching, their faces and clothes black with soot. The air was thick with the foul, damp smell of burnt hay and wet ash. Ellie looked at Jake. His strong shoulders, usually so straight, were slumped in utter defeat. He stared at the smoking ruin, his face a mask of hollowed-out despair. All the fight, all the adrenaline of the night had drained away, leaving behind a vast, empty landscape of loss. The winter feed was gone, every last bale of it. It was their security, their insurance against the harsh Montana winter. It was months of hard labor turned to ash in a single night. The financial blow was catastrophic. It was more than a setback. It was a checkmate. Blackwood hadn't needed to kill them. He had just needed to make it impossible for them to survive. Jake finally turned to look at her, his brown eyes glistening with unshed tears of pure exhaustion and terror. His voice was a broken whisper, fragile as burnt paper. "He won, Ellie," he said, the words choked with defeat. We can't beat him. This is what happens. We should have known. We have to stop this. We have to give up." The words hung in the cold, smoky air. Give up. The phrase echoed in Ellie's mind, tasting like poison. She looked at Jake's soot-stained face, at the trembling of his hands. She saw the 15 years of hopelessness crashing back down on him, burying the brief flicker of defiance they had found together. She felt a wave of fear herself, cold and deep. But beneath it, something else was solidifying. It was the memory of a past she had run from, a past where she had been powerless. She would not be powerless again. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough, grimy, and cold, but his fingers instinctively closed around hers. She held his gaze, her own blue eyes clear and unwavering, despite the ruins surrounding them. The fire had taken their hay, but it had given her something in return. It had burned away the last of her fear, leaving only a core of pure, unbending steel. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with absolute conviction in the morning silence. She squeezed his hand, a small, firm pressure. "This isn't why we give up, Jake." He looked at her, his expression lost in questioning. She held his eyes and let him see the fire that was now burning inside her. "This is why we have to win." The acrid smell of smoke clung to their clothes as they rode toward prosperity. They did not wash the soot from their skin. It was a declaration. Amid the smoking ruins of the hay barn, Ellie's hand had been an anchor for Jake. The cold knot of terror in his stomach remained, but her words had forged a new and unbending purpose inside him. He was no longer just surviving. Now they had to win. Arthur Finch saw the grime on their faces and his usual cynical demeanor vanished. He rose from his cluttered desk. "This is what he does," Finch said, his voice low and gravelly. "He pushes until you break or he burns you out." Ellie stepped closer, her presence filling the small room. "He failed," she stated, her voice steady. "This only proves we are on the right path." Jake stood beside her, his tall frame rigid with a new resolve. "We need to file the papers," he said, his voice raspy. "Now." Finch held their gaze, searching for any hint of doubt. He found none. With a slow nod, he laid out the documents. It was a formal complaint charging Silas Blackwood with 15 years of systematic fraud. "Signing this is like firing the first shot in a war," the lawyer warned. "He will use every tool he has to destroy you." Ellie replied quietly, "He already tried to burn us to the ground." Jake picked up the pen. His hand, stained with soot, trembled for a second as he thought of his father. He signed his name, Jacob Miller, the letters firm and clear. He then passed the pen to Ellie. Her own signature, Eleanor Vance, was just as unshakable. The lawyer blotted the ink. "I'll register this immediately. By this afternoon, the whole town will know." Leaving the office, the air on the main street felt charged. People who normally offered a greeting now stared from a distance. Their whispers followed them like shadows. Suddenly, a handsome black carriage pulled to a halt, and Silas Blackwood stepped onto the boardwalk. He was dressed in his usual impeccable dark suit. His cold gray eyes swept past Ellie, palm, landing squarely on Jake in a public dismissal. Jacob! Blackwood's voice was smooth as polished stone. I was sorry to hear about your little accident. Carelessness can be so costly. Jake's hands clenched into fists. The old instinct to bow his head and simply endure rose in his throat like bile. Blackwood gave a thin, predatory smile. Your father at least understood his place. Withdraw this foolish lawsuit. Continue and I will tear down everything your family ever built. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the two men. Then Jake felt a gentle pressure on his arm. Ellie had moved to stand beside him. She looked directly at Silas Blackwood, her blue eyes clear and unwavering. His father honored his debt, Mr. Blackwood, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the thick tension on the street. In fact, he paid it in full more than 7 years ago. Everything since then has been theft. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. No one had ever spoken to Silas Blackwood like that. His mask of control cracked, revealing a flash of pure rage before he mastered it. He turned his chilling gaze on Ellie. You must be the mail-order bride, he sneered, a bookkeeper from the East, meddling in affairs you cannot comprehend. Ellie did not falter. I comprehend numbers, and I recognize fraud. She took a small, defiant step forward. The Miller family owes you nothing. We will see you in court. The silence that followed was absolute. It was broken by the rhythmic tread of heavy boots. Sheriff Davies was approaching, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes darting between Blackwood's furious face and Ellie's calm one. In his hand, he held a folded piece of paper. Mr. Blackwood, the sheriff said, his voice strained, a formal complaint has been filed with the circuit court. I am required to serve you with this summons. He held out the paper. Blackwood stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake, his jaw clenched so tight that a muscle jumped. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he snatched the summons from the sheriff's grasp. He crushed the paper in his fist, his knuckles white. His cold eyes left the sheriff and settled on Ellie. The look in them was a silent, chilling promise of absolute ruin. The courtroom air was thick with dust and anxiety. Every bench was filled with faces Ellie recognized from town, all eyes on her. She sat on the witness stand, her hands folded in her lap. Across the room, Jake sat beside their lawyer, his gaze fixed on Silas Blackwood. A muscle pulsed in his tense jaw. Blackwood looked relaxed in his fine city suit, watching Ellie with a condescending smile. His lawyer Peterson approached the stand. Miss Vance, he began, his voice smooth. You arrived in prosperity just a few months ago, a mail-order bride. Her heart hammered, but her voice was steady. I came to marry Jacob Miller and build a home. Peterson gestured to the ledgers on the evidence table. And in that short time, you claim to have uncovered a 15-year conspiracy, one that 2 generations of Miller men somehow missed. Ellie met his gaze, calm. She had practiced this moment for weeks. I did not uncover a conspiracy, she said. I corrected the math. The ledgers did the rest. Peterson paced before her. Life out here is not about numbers. It is about trust. It is about a man like my client extending a hand when no one else would. The numbers show he never let go of that hand, Ellie said. He just kept taking more. The lawyer's friendly mask slipped. Show me one. An entry so complex a farmer could not understand it, but a clever city girl could. This was the moment. Ellie leaned forward. There is nothing complex about it. It is simple theft. She looked to the judge. May I have the ledgers, Your Honor? The heavy books were placed before her. She opened the oldest one, her finger tracing a line in faded ink. On May 10th, 18 years ago, a payment of $50 was made. Mr. Blackwood's ledger records it as $45. Her voice was steady. The $5 difference was added back to the debt with interest. Over 20 years, that single $5 entry became over $100 of phantom debt. She turned a page. It happened again 2 months later, and again the next year. Small amounts, easily overlooked. She looked at the jury, men who understood the value of $5. He was not just taking their money. He was stealing their time, their work, their hope. Peterson objected, but the damage was done. Ellie had spoken their language. Finally, she presented the receipts, the one from the Bible and 3 others from an old tin box. Each receipt proved a payment that Blackwood's records had marked as missed. A deep silence filled the room. Ellie felt drained as she walked back to her seat, her legs trembling. As she sat, Jake reached out and touched her arm for a second. The brief, grounding pressure said everything. Blackwood's lawyer tried to dismiss the receipts as forgeries, but the spell of fear was broken. From the back of the room, an old farmer named Thomas slowly stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice raspy, "my family has a loan with Mr. Blackwood, too." Peterson objected, but the judge held up a hand. "Let the man speak." Thomas gripped the bench before him. "We have been paying for 30 years. I asked how much was left. Mr. Blackwood said the paperwork was too complex for a farmer to understand." His eyes met Ellie's. "But I understand $5. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A widow stood up, then another man. A trickle of courage began to flow. Their stories painted a picture of a man who preyed on the town's trust for decades. Silas Blackwood sat frozen, his composure finally cracking. The power he built with fear dissolved in the light of day. The judge's ruling was swift. The debt was declared void, paid in full 7 years ago. He ordered Blackwood to pay damages to Jacob Miller, a sum that drew a collective gasp. The sharp crack of the gavel felt like thunder. Weeks later, the dust had settled. Blackwood's office was shuttered. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the golden fields of the Miller farm. The air smelled of cut hay and rich earth. Ellie stood on the porch at sunset. She heard Jake's boots on the steps behind her. He came to stand beside her, sharing the view. The land, the house, it was all theirs now, truly theirs. He had worked tirelessly since the verdict, repairing the barn and tending the fields. The slump in his shoulders was gone. He stood straight, a man who owned his own life. He reached out and took her hand. His rough palm was gentle against hers. The quiet touch had become their language, speaking of gratitude, respect, and a love grown from shared struggle. He squeezed her hand. "Our fields," he said, his voice full of quiet wonder. Ellie looked up at him. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a warm, steady light. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling his strength. The future was not a debt to be paid. It was this porch, this man, this quiet moment.